Sometimes a Great Notion. Wow. Just wow, what a work. Do you know, it might be the great American novel. It really is up there with Great Gatsby and East of Eden. And to me, Infinite Jest is the great American novel. I don't think anything's ever going to top Infinite Jest. But it's up there, man. Geez, as soon as I was maybe 100 pages into the book, I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was so incredible. So, what is Sometimes a Great Notion about? It takes place in rural Oregon in the middle 20th century, and there's a family who owns a logging company. They're called the Stamper family, and their workers are currently on strike. So Hank Stamper, the oldest brother and the owner at the time, he asks Leland Stamper, who has moved to the east coast, and he asks him to come back to the west coast and help them with the work. Now, Hank Stamper is your average blue-collar, hard-working man, you know, real gruff, but a real stand-up guy for sure. And Leland is kind of a prissy academic young guy who's super intelligent and knows way too much about way too many things, but I don't think he's done a single lick of hard work in his life. So these two worlds kind of collide in Sometimes a Great Notion, and lots of really cool, interesting stuff happens. Now let me give you a little bit of a backstory on Ken Kesey. He wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, another great American novel, but, you know, not a sort of magnum opus like this one is, as far as I'm concerned. And he did a lot of acid. He went around with the merry band of pranksters, is what they call themselves. They went in like this cool technicolored bus, and they went from the west coast to the east coast and back. And I think during this time, if I'm not mistaken, Ken Kesey was either in the middle of writing the novel or he had it like mostly finished. And I think maybe by the time he got to New York, they had like a sort of release party. Now, I read some of Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, where Tom Wolfe, and I believe he was a journalist at this time, he hung out with a merry band of pranksters. And I recall him saying that critics weren't very favorable toward this book. And I don't understand why. And I try to kind of look at old reviews, but I couldn't even find any. So I kind of want to hear what people thought back then. But maybe it's because they were expecting something that was so much a part of the sort of free love boomer generation, you know, where people were just acid freaks and listening to Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix, you know, doing random crazy stuff and living in communes and whatever else. And maybe they were sort of expecting that ethic that Ken Kesey kind of spearheaded in a way. Maybe they were expecting that to come out in his work, and instead they get a book about working class blue collar Americans. But that doesn't take away from it at all. If anything, I think it adds to the depth of Kesey's character, because he's a kind of guy who can be so diverse and eclectic to lead these crazy acid head freaks on a journey across the country, and then write such a grounded, just American novel. He's truly an interesting figure. So after this book came out, he didn't put anything else out for 3 decades, basically. I think he put out like maybe a short story or something. I have to look at that again. But yeah, man, he put this novel out and he was basically like, hey, that's it. That's it. What else can I do after this? There's a preface at the beginning that I actually read after the book, because I don't like reading the sort of prefaces and introductions beforehand, because a lot of times they have spoilers and they just give too much away. So, but I do like reading them afterward. And this guy said that Ken Kesey is that old-fashioned kind of writer, the moral critic, the prophet without a prophecy, a person who is cut from that moth-eaten old bolt of wool we'd forgotten up in the attic, the stuff Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, to name 2, were cut from. And I couldn't agree with that more. The novel begins with a very long-winded backstory. Well, okay, so the novel kind of begins in media res. It actually begins at the end of the book. And then, you know, one of the characters, who's actually just kind of a side character, really, Jonathan Drager, who's kind of like a union man. He's talking to the wife of Hank Stamper, Vivian, I believe is her name. Anyway, and then she goes back and takes you through the whole history of the Stamper family, which I just loved the way that was written. As soon as that got going, I was hooked, because it the narrative that was incorporated was so fascinating. Obviously, the in media res thing has been done a bunch of times, but even as you're learning about the Stamper family, and it kind of gets to a point in the Stamper family genealogy, and then it kind of goes back a little bit to like their grandfathers and their grandfathers, and then it kind of just gives you this lineage of this family who's so hardworking and won't take no for an answer. The opening is kind of reminiscent to me of East of Eden, where you have just a whole genealogy of characters taking place. Whereas East of Eden it happens over the course of the book. I haven't read that book in a while, so my memory is a little fuzzy, but if I recall, the two main characters, aka the Cain and Abel of the book, don't even really come to prominence until probably about halfway, maybe. Whereas this book kind of lays out a huge genealogy up front, probably over the course of, I don't remember, like 50 or 60 pages, and then you're stuck with Hank and Leland. Okay, so I want to talk about the characters a bit. I already talked about Hank and Leland, but I kind of want to get into it a little more. So like I said, Hank and Leland are polar opposites. Leland is hyper academic, and Hank is just like a blue-collar kind of guy. Both very, very strong characters, so well thought out. Leland essentially is seeking revenge on Hank, kind of like a Cain and Abel sort of setup, and he's just harboring this resentment and hatred towards his older brother. So Leland is just this really resentful character, but you really sympathize with him because he knows he's terribly resentful, and he's trying to do something about it. He just thinks if he gets revenge on his brother, that everything will be okay, and his life that he was robbed of will finally be a regular life. But of course we know that that's not true, and so you're kind of rooting for him to get over it, but he never really does. It's really tragic. If anything, Leland reminds me of the Underground Man from Dostoevsky's book, where he's just so hyper obsessed and fixated on a thing, and he's gonna go do it, and he's gonna do it, and the world is out to get him, and the world sucks, and then when he has the opportunity to do it, he's just too afraid and he backs down. And this happens continuously throughout the novel. I wouldn't at all be surprised if the Underground Man was a source of inspiration for Leland's character. And he also reminds me of, if you ever read John Fante, I highly recommend you read John Fante if you're a fan of Bukowski. I think it's Road to Los Angeles, where John Fante is basically just doing like a little autobiography on him as a kid moving to Los Angeles. And he goes and he takes on these blue-collar jobs working in, canning factories and whatever else he's doing. And he's just proclaiming the whole time, he's like, I'm the smartest, and I am a writer, and you will respect me because I am a writer. And Leland reminds me of that a lot, too, where he's such an academician thrust into this world of blue-collar working, and he has to constantly show and prove everyone what he knows, kind of prove his worth and his value. But nobody really cares about that stuff. They just care about how many logs you can cut down. Every character is just so diverse and colorful and very memorable. Every one of them. Even the side characters are memorable. There's this character who ends up killing himself because he thinks everything that's gone wrong is Hank Stamper's fault. And I don't remember his name, but that was a really great scene in the book. And never mind the fact that basically this whole story is told from Vivian's perspective too, because at the beginning she's kind of going through a scrapbook, and then that's when we do the whole flashback thing. Syntax and the narrative structure, which is probably my favorite part about this book. Kesey is just playing with language. There's so much artistry and so much masterfulness. This is a guy who's at the top of his craft. He's never been better. To me, the thing about a great artist is that, like someone like David Bowie, for instance, they will always be pushing themselves, and you can tell when they're pushing themselves. You can tell, like, when David Bowie put out Diamond Dogs and then he did Young Americans, you can tell, like, here's all this knowledge he learned and gained from Diamond Dogs and everything previous, and that's all part of him, and he's really good at it. But he's gonna go in this direction. He's gonna play around. Like when he does Young Americans, it's like, you know, he's playing with soul music, and whether he hits or not is up to you. But in terms of Sometimes a Great Notion, Ken Kesey clearly has very strongly developed characters and narrative and plot and all of that good stuff that, you know, is probably coming over from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And then he's experimenting with syntax and narrative so strongly. It's like he was reading William Faulkner or something. In the middle of a paragraph, you will have a change in perspective. So the paragraph might start off with like third person omniscient kind of narrator thing, and that might be in, you know, regular words, whatever. And below it, at some point, we'll start italics. And so italics will actually be like first person narrative of Hank Stamper, for instance, and you'll hear all of his words and how he's speaking very like blue collar and gruff and all those sorts of things. And then, you know, after the italics for a couple sentences, maybe it'll go back to regular, you know, regular words. I don't know what you call that. Normal words. It's not italics, it's not bold, I don't know. It's unaffected, whatever it is. But then maybe further on down the page, there's parentheses, you know? And those parentheses might be Leland Stamper. Or at one of the great moments in the book, it's from the dog's point of view. And that was pretty fun. Kesey is so good at writing that you can tell who these people are just by the way he writes. So when he's writing from the perspective of Leland Stamper, he's so verbose and he's so colorful and his words are so long-winded in his sentences, and he's like talking too much, and he's so academic and intellectual. And you can tell just by the way it's written that it's from Leland's perspective. And then similarly speaking, when he talks from Hank's perspective, it's the same kind of thing where you can just tell where it says, oh, dadgummit, or whatever these blue-collar folks say. So then it becomes kind of like a puzzle. And that's what I love, is it's a little challenging at first, at least for me and where I'm at, like whatever my level of reading comprehension is, whatever that might be. For me, it was just a little bit challenging. Like every time the narrative perspective shifts, you're slightly confused, but then you quickly figure it out and you understand what's going on. And to me, as a lover of literature and novels and just good writing, that tiny little challenge was so rewarding and captivating. Every page was like a little reward. You know, it's like playing a good video game, like Legend of Zelda, for instance, or Portal, where you do the puzzle and like at first you're a little confused doing the puzzle, so you kind of scratch your head for maybe a couple minutes, and then you actually figure it out pretty quickly. So the puzzle really isn't all that hard, but it makes you stop and think. And then when you get to the other side, you feel smarter for it. You feel like you were respected. Yeah, and that feeling is just constantly throughout the book. So then it's that feeling coupled with the awe and amazement of, wow, I'm watching an artist just play. That's all they're doing is just playing. They're having fun. They have so much mastery, you can just watch them experiment and figure things out as it goes. Because that idea of the syntax changing like that, you know, towards the end of the book, it gets so much more complicated. So like when the climax happens, it's so riveting. It's just quickly going back and forth between italics and parentheses and regular writing, and you're just constantly shifting perspectives, and it makes the climax so much more frenetic and so much more chaotic. And it's like a climax I've never experienced before, I'm going to be totally honest. In all the movies I've watched and all the books I've read, TV shows, everything, it's just, everything comes together. And it's a tragedy unlike any other tragedy. You know, it's on par with Shakespearean tragedies and Greek tragedies, where it's just so, you just have such a stab in your heart, and you really feel for Hank Stamper once the climax happens. Just so many terrible, awful things are happening at once to his character, and it's incredible, man. It's really incredible. Now I think I'm going to read some of my favorite quotes and prose from the book. Stuff I highlighted along the way. Page 25. The willows fluttering beyond the windows vibrate toward motionlessness, like spokes standing still on a careening Hollywood wagon wheel. Very pretty. Ken Kesey can definitely turn a phrase. Page 147. Hank is recalling his old high school debaucheries. And he's talking to a girl, and he says, "It's like this, sweetie britches. I might say to some little high school honey we was parked someplace, steaming up the windows of the old man's pickup in some Saturday night battle of the bra." Good, very good prose. Page 200. Hank is recalling a time he got himself into a fight by running his incessant trap. The metaphor is exquisite, and the colorful prose nestled within is just the cherry on top. I talked myself out on one of these little crickety limbs to no place and ended up hanging out there like a damned fool, with the adrenaline pumping and my mouth flapping its wings to try to fly farther for Christ's sakes out instead of retreating back along that same illogical limb I got my dumb ass out on in the first place. Page 19, there's a very astute and concise observation on how we interpret silence around the dinner table. The meal continued, if not in silence, at least without the benefit of words. And then it goes on. The absence of talk fills Lee with almost uncontrollable nervousness. The silence is directed specifically at him, like a spotlight on a suspect in a police lineup, waiting. He recalls an old joke. "So you studied 4 years of trigonometry, eh? Okay, then say something to me in trigonum." They're waiting for me to say something to justify all those years of study, something worthwhile. I concluded my work on pancakes and was in the process of finishing up a cup of coffee. So this is a great example of a shift in perspective, because the paragraph starts out as being third-person omniscient, and before you know it, you're in Leland Stamper's head. Like, it just kind of happens. It's magical. Page 274, curlicues of barbered pine fell like trimmed tresses at his feet. And, of course, this is something only Leland Stamper would say. You don't even just listening to that, there's no other character in the book would write anything like that. Page 294, I stood with a bowl of fetched cream fragrant as alfalfa in my hands, watching the dark poultice of dusk draw bull bats from their hideaways, listening to their throated diving buzzes blending in years with that honking from across the river. More Leland Stamper. Page 354. I have been forced for 10 fiendish hours a day, 6 solid days a week, to subject my sinews to such sadistic stress as walking, running, stumbling, fumbling, falling down and getting back up and walking again, as I all the while drag a rusty iron cable, the obstinance of which is rivaled solely by the obstinance of the gargantuan log I am supposed to tie said cable around. Very complicated sentence. Really, really fun though. Leland and Hank are drunk and having an argument about music. Hank says, "That stuff of yours sounds like the musicians all squat to pee. La lee, la lee, la lee." It's good, Hank. Page 543. A character is writing a note to his wife, and I really like how nonchalantly the change in narration perspective takes place. It says, "Then he took out another sheet of paper and advised his wife his cold was much improved and that he thought he would drive on to Astoria tonight instead of sleeping a few hours and getting up early in the morning. Would have phoned about meeting change but hate to wake you. Weather might be worse in the morning the way it looks." Yeah, it's masterful. Again, I'm going to keep saying that word because this book is just rife with masterfulness. Page 548. I listened, wondering what strange midnight doings were afoot, and, after I heard the boat start outside and roar up off the river, afloat. Very cute sentence. One that makes you kind of read it again, because at first you're confused, and then you realize what he's doing. Page 673. I knew that I had in no way achieved the stature I had subconsciously dreamed that my revenge would bring about. Amen, Leland. I think that foreshadowing could be seen from not page 1, but very early on in the book. You know, the audience could see this coming from a mile away. Tragedies nestled within tragedies. Leland Stamper finally succeeds in getting what he wants, and the moment isn't nearly as victorious as his obsessions led him to believe it would be. I think that about does it. This is an incredibly long review. But I just love this book. I really, really love it. You know, maybe once a year, I might read a novel that just totally floors me, and it actually leaves my jaw agape, and sometimes I just set it down for a second, and I'm just kind of going over what I just read, and I'm so beside myself at how something so incredible could have been written. And Ken Kesey knew it, and that's why he didn't write another work for decades, and none of those works held up to it. Anyway, I hope you like my review. Be sure to like and subscribe.